The first knock came at dawn, so faint Marcus Chin almost mistook it for the wind rattling the ghost of his past. He had been awake for hours, staring at his idle hands that used to carve masterpieces but now only held the weight of a fire that took everything. He thought his life had ended the day the workshop burned down, consuming his apprentice and his purpose. But a starving shepherd puppy appeared at his door, followed by another and another, teaching him that redemption doesn't come from hiding in the dark. It comes from opening the door when you're most afraid. God doesn't always send angels with wings to save us. Sometimes He sends 3 broken things to make us whole again. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The Colorado mist hung heavy over the mountain, a freezing white veil that turned the world to silence. Inside the remote cabin, Marcus Chin sat on the edge of his unmade bed, listening to the crushing quiet. He had learned to wake before the sun, a habit left over from 20 years of running a bustling workshop, though now there was no work to be done. His tools lay in the corner, covered in dust, artifacts of a man who had died 6 months ago along with a 19-year-old boy named Jamie. But this morning, what broke the silence wasn't the nightmare of crackling flames or the phantom sound of sirens. It was a scratching, soft, desperate, against the bottom of the heavy oak door. Marcus froze, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in months. The air inside smelled of stale sawdust and cold ash. For a moment he told himself it was just a branch. But then came a whimper, low and trembling, followed by the slide of a body against the wood. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the narrow hallway. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He caught his reflection in the clouded mirror by the entry. A man in his early 40s but looking decades older. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by grief-induced starvation. His black hair was prematurely graying at the temples, and his deep-set brown eyes held a perpetual flinch, the look of a man who expected everything he touched to turn to ash. Marcus opened the door cautiously. The winter air bit at his exposed skin, turning his breath into smoke. Sitting there on the porch, shivering violently in the snow, was a cream-colored shepherd puppy. It couldn't have been more than 10 weeks old. Its fur was matted with ice and grime, its ribs cutting sharp lines against its skin. One ear flopped down while the other swiveled toward him. But it was the eyes, tear-filled, terrified, yet clinging to a shred of hope, that stopped Marcus cold. The puppy didn't run. It just looked at him, shaking on 3 legs, holding the 4th up as if asking for mercy. Marcus scanned the tree line, his paranoia spiking. He looked for tire tracks, footprints, the brutal man who owned the illegal mill rumored to be in these woods. Nothing. Just the vast, indifferent forest. "You're at the wrong house," Marcus rasped, his voice rusty from disuse. The puppy whimpered again and inched forward, its nose twitching toward the warmth of the cabin. Marcus felt the instinct to slam the door, to protect his isolation, to refuse the responsibility of another life that could be lost. He didn't know yet that this was only the first knock. He didn't know that tomorrow there would be 2 and the day after 3. He simply looked at the shivering creature and felt the ice around his heart crack, just enough to let the terror in. The silence in the Colorado high country had a weight to it, a physical pressure that pressed against the eardrums and settled deep in the chest. For Marcus Chin, this silence was the only companion he felt he deserved. The cabin sat like a rough-hewn scar on the mountainside, isolated by miles of dense pine and heavy snowdrifts. He had built the structure years ago as a weekend getaway for him and Elena, a place to drink wine by the fire and escape the noise of the city. Now it was his penance. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of cold ash and the dust that had settled over everything. Marcus sat in the gloom of the pre-dawn light, his hands resting on the rough grain of the kitchen table. They were hands that had once shaped mahogany and walnut into pieces of art, hands that were celebrated in design magazines across Denver. Now they were dry and idle, the calluses softening, the strength fading. He couldn't look at them without seeing the soot. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing the charred ruins of his workshop, or hearing the phantom echo of the sirens that had arrived 20 minutes too late. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the fire. 6 months since he had driven away to pick up a specialized order of cherry wood, leaving 19-year-old Jamie Rodriguez alone to finish sanding a table. "I'll be back in an hour, kid. Don't burn the place down," he had joked. The irony tasted like bile in his throat every morning. A faulty wire, a spark in the sawdust, a blocked exit. Jamie hadn't stood a chance. And Marcus, the master craftsman who prided himself on precision and safety, had been the architect of the boy's tomb. Marcus pushed away from the table, the chair scraping loud and harsh against the floor. He moved to the window, staring out at the gray, indistinct shapes of the forest. He was a widower twice over, first by cancer, which took Elena 4 years ago, and then by his own negligence, which took the boy he had come to love like a son. He had come here to wait out the rest of his days, to ensure he never hurt anyone else again. Then the sound came. It wasn't the wind. The wind howled and rattled. This was specific. A soft, rhythmic scratching against the base of the heavy oak door. Scritch, scritch, pause. Marcus froze. His first instinct was to ignore it. A raccoon, perhaps, or a bold fox. But the scratching was followed by a sound that cut through the cabin's oppressive quiet, a whimper. It was high-pitched and desperate, the sound of something small realizing it was alone in a world that didn't care. Against his better judgment, Marcus crossed the room. He unlocked the deadbolt, the metal cold under his fingers, and pulled the door open just enough to see out. The cold rushed in, biting at his ankles, but Marcus didn't feel it. He was staring down at a bundle of dirty, cream-colored fur shivering on his welcome mat. It was a German Shepherd puppy, impossibly small, its coat matted with mud and ice. The creature looked up at him with eyes that were too old for its face, dark, frightened, and rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that kills. The puppy didn't wag its tail. It didn't jump. It simply sat there, trembling violently, lifting one frozen paw in the air as if asking permission to exist. Marcus gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to shut the door. Don't engage. Don't look at it. You are poison. Go on, Marcus rasped, his voice cracking from weeks of disuse. Get out of here. The puppy flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a soft, rattling exhale and laid its chin on its paws, closing its eyes as if accepting that if it was going to freeze to death, it might as well do it near a source of heat. Marcus cursed under his breath. It was the same curse he used when a chisel slipped, or when a joint didn't flush perfectly, a sound of frustration at his own failing resolve. He couldn't leave it to die. He was a coward, he told himself, but not a monster. Not that kind, anyway. He stepped back inside, leaving the door cracked, and went to the pantry. He found a bag of dried beef jerky, remnants of the supplies he bought in bulk to avoid trips to town. He tore off a strip, then filled a plastic bowl with lukewarm water from the kettle. When he returned to the porch, the puppy hadn't moved. It looked like a discarded toy, forgotten in the snow. Marcus knelt, the movement making his knees pop. He set the water down. The puppy's nose twitched. Slowly, painfully, it lifted its head. It lapped at the water, tentatively at first, then with frantic desperation. The sound of its drinking was the loudest thing in the valley. Marcus held out the jerky. The puppy sniffed his hand, its cold, wet nose grazing his fingers. Marcus pulled back as if he'd been burned. The contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of life, of softness, of things that could be hurt. Eat, Marcus commanded softly, dropping the meat on the wood. The puppy devoured it in seconds, hardly chewing. Then it looked up at him again, and for a second, the fear in its eyes cleared, replaced by a flicker of gratitude that terrified Marcus more than the cold. That's it, Marcus said, standing up abruptly. He towered over the small animal, casting a long shadow across the porch. That's all I have for you. The puppy whined, a sound that tried to bridge the gap between them. It took a hesitant step toward the open door, toward the warmth of the wood stove inside. Marcus blocked the way with his boot. No. The word hung in the frozen air. The puppy stopped, confusing clouding its dark eyes. You can't come in, Marcus said, and he was speaking to himself as much as the dog. I don't do this. I don't take care of things anymore. You understand? I break things. He looked at the puppy's ribs, visible through the thin, dirty fur. He thought of Jamie, how the boy had looked up to him, trusted him to keep the workshop safe. He thought of the phone calls he had ignored while the building burned. To invite this creature in was to make a promise of protection, and Marcus Chin knew his promises were made of smoke. Go home, Marcus said, his voice hardening. Find somewhere safe. This isn't it. He stepped back and closed the heavy door. The latch clicked, a final decisive sound. Marcus stood there for a long time, his forehead resting against the wood, listening. He heard a few more scratches, faint and pleading. Then silence. He spent the rest of the day in a fugue state, moving through the cabin like a ghost. He cleaned tools that were already clean. He stared at the unread books on his shelf. But every few minutes, his gaze drifted to the window. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted. Finally, unable to stop himself, Marcus went to the window that overlooked the porch. The porch was empty. He felt a wash of relief, followed immediately by a sharp, hollow pang in his gut. The puppy was gone. It had likely wandered back to wherever it came from, or perhaps the cold had driven it to find deeper shelter in the woods. Good, Marcus told himself, turning away from the glass. It's better this way. It learned early not to rely on me. He made a meager dinner of canned soup, eating standing up at the counter. The cabin felt larger tonight, the corners darker. The silence, which he usually wore like armor, felt different now. It felt judgmental. He told himself it was a one-time encounter. A random stray passing through. Nature was cruel and he was just a bystander. He had offered a meal. That was more than most would do. He had done his duty without getting entangled. He had kept his boundaries. Marcus washed his bowl and turned off the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. He lay in bed, staring at the exposed beams of the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take him. But as the wind picked up outside, whistling through the eaves, he couldn't stop thinking about the way the puppy had looked at him. Not with hunger but with recognition. As if it knew something about him that he had forgotten. He closed his eyes, willing the image away. It's over, he thought. Just a stray. It's gone. But Marcus was wrong. As he drifted into a restless sleep, he didn't hear the sound of the wind changing. He didn't know that deep in the forest eyes were watching. And he certainly didn't know that the scratching at the door was not an ending, but a beginning. Because the next morning, the silence wouldn't just be broken. It would be doubled. The following morning, the silence didn't even get a chance to settle. Marcus was already awake, standing in the center of the kitchen with a mug of black coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He told himself he wasn't waiting. He told himself he was just checking the structural integrity of the window frames, or listening to the groan of the cabin settling in the sub-zero temperature. But his eyes kept darting to the heavy oak door, and his ears were straining against the quiet, tuned to a frequency he hadn't cared about 48 hours ago. Dawn broke differently today, grayer, heavier. The light struggled to pierce the cloud cover, casting the room in a flat, slate gloom. Then it came. It wasn't the hesitant scratch of the previous day. This was louder, frantic. It was the sound of claws digging into wood with purpose, accompanied by a sharp, rhythmic yip that cut through the cabin's insulation like a serrated blade. Marcus set his mug down on the counter with a thud. His heart did a traitorous flip in his chest, half annoyance, half relief. He came back. The thought was immediately followed by a wave of irritation. Animals were creatures of habit. By feeding the stray yesterday, Marcus knew he had signed a contract he hadn't read. Stubborn, he muttered, marching to the door. I told you no vacancy. He threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open, prepared to shout the animal off his property, to stomp his boot and play the part of the angry hermit until the creature got the message. The shout died in his throat. The cream-colored puppy from yesterday, Finn, though Marcus refused to think of him by a name yet, was there. But he wasn't alone. Pressed tight against his flank, shivering so violently her teeth chattered audibly, was a second puppy. She was slightly smaller, her coat a lighter, sandy beige, but her demeanor was strikingly different. While Finn looked up with pleading, soulful eyes, this new arrival met Marcus's gaze with a fierce, challenging stare. She stood on trembling legs, chest puffed out despite her emaciation, placing herself slightly in front of Finn as if to shield him. Marcus stared. One was a stray. Two was a conspiracy. You have got to be kidding me, Marcus whispered. The cold wind whipped around his legs, but he didn't close the door. Both dogs looked worse than the day before. Their ribs were not just visible, they were aggressive protrusions against their skin. Their fur was matted with frozen mud and burrs. They swayed slightly as they stood, exhaustion radiating off them in waves. Yet, despite their weakness, they stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front against the giant in the doorway. Finn nudged the female's ear with his nose, a gesture of reassurance so tender it made Marcus look away. It reminded him of things he had buried, the way Elena used to squeeze his hand during chemotherapy treatments, the silent language of shared suffering. I suppose you want breakfast too, Marcus said, his voice devoid of warmth but lacking the conviction to send them away. He turned his back on them, leaving the door open a crack, a dangerous concession. He went to the pantry and retrieved the rest of the jerky and a leftover hard-boiled egg. He grabbed a second bowl for water. When he returned to the porch, neither dog had tried to cross the threshold. They knew the rules. They were waiting for mercy, not stealing it. Marcus set the bowls down. Eat. The female, Rosie, his mind supplied unbidden, naming her for her pink, frostbitten nose, didn't move immediately. She watched Marcus's hands, checking for threats. Only when Finn stepped forward and began to eat did she lower her head. Then she ate with a savagery that spoke of days, maybe weeks, without food. Marcus crouched nearby, watching them. The skepticism that had shielded him yesterday was beginning to crack, replaced by a darker, colder realization. These weren't random strays born in the wild. They were too distinct, too similar in age. As Rosie stretched her neck to lick the bottom of the bowl, Marcus saw it. The fur around her neck was worn away in a raw, red ring. The skin underneath was scabbed and weeping. He looked at Finn and saw the same thing, hidden beneath the thicker ruff of his neck. Marcus reached out, his hand hovering over Finn. The puppy flinched but didn't run. Marcus gently brushed the fur aside. The marks were unmistakable. They were indentations from wire, tight, unyielding wire that had been left on as they grew, cutting into the flesh. "Who did this to you?" Marcus whispered. The rage that flared in his gut was sudden and hot, melting the ice of his apathy. This wasn't neglect. This was torture. He stood up, his knees cracking, and looked out at the silent forest. The trees looked different now. They weren't just a barrier against the world, they were hiding something. He went back inside, leaving the puppies on the porch, and walked straight to the dusty console table where his landline sat. He hadn't used it in weeks. He picked up the receiver, the dial tone humming in his ear, and punched in a number he had memorized but never called. "Ranger Station, District 4. This is Sarah." The voice was clear, professional, and irritatingly familiar. Sarah Kim had been the ranger who investigated the fire 6 months ago. She was thorough, kind, and the last person Marcus wanted to talk to. "It's Marcus Chin," he said, keeping his voice flat. There was a pause. "Marcus, I haven't heard from you in a while. Is everything all right? The weather up there is supposed to turn nasty tonight." "I'm fine," he cut her off. "I have a question. Hypothetical." "Okay," Sarah said, her tone shifting, becoming sharper. "I'm listening. If someone found strays, dogs, up in the high pass, what's the protocol?" "Strays?" Sarah asked. "Marcus, you know the protocol. You call animal control or bring them in. But we don't usually get strays that far up unless they're dumped." "And if they had marks?" Marcus asked, staring out the window at the two huddled forms on his porch. "Wire marks on their necks. Like they'd been tied up." The line went silent for a beat too long. "Marcus," Sarah's voice dropped an octave. "Are we talking about shepherds? German shepherds?" Marcus tightened his grip on the phone. "Hypothetically." "Listen to me," Sarah said, the pleasantness gone. "We've had reports." "Rumors, really?" "An illegal breeding operation moving through the state forests. High volume, low care. Puppy mills. They set up in abandoned structures, breed the animals until they drop, and move on before we can pin them down. If you see dogs like that, they aren't just strays. They're evidence. And the people running those operations, they're not the kind of people you want to cross." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. "I see. Marcus, do you have the dogs?" "I just saw tracks," he lied smoothly. "Just wondering what they were." "Thanks, Sarah. Wait, if you see anything else, you call M." Marcus hung up. He stood by the phone, his breathing shallow. Evidence. If he turned them in, they would be logged, tagged, and put into the system. They would be separated. And if they were sick or too traumatized, they might be put down. Or worse, returned to an owner who claimed them back before the law caught up. He walked to the window. The puppies hadn't left. They had finished the food and water and were now curled up together on the welcome mat, a singular ball of fur against the encroaching gray of the storm. Finn had his head resting on Rosie's flank. Rosie was watching the door, her eyes heavy but vigilant. They were waiting for him. Marcus pressed his hand against the cold glass. The condensation bloomed around his fingers. He had spent 6 months pushing the world away, convinced that his touch destroyed everything he loved. He had isolated himself to keep others safe from his failure. But looking at the two shivering creatures, he realized the pattern. One yesterday, two today. They weren't just finding him, they were escaping to him. "You're making a mistake," he told the puppies through the glass. "I can't save you." But as he watched Finn shiver and press closer to his sister, Marcus knew he wasn't going to call animal control. Not yet. He turned away from the window, but the image of the two puppies burned behind his eyelids. 1, 2. The math gnawed at him. If there were 2 of them today, escaping from some hell deep in the woods, it raised a question that made his blood run cold. Where was the rest of the litter? And if the pattern held, what would be waiting for him at dawn tomorrow? Marcus checked the lock on the door, then checked it again. The wind howled, sounding less like air and more like a warning. He had the terrible, sinking feeling that the third knock wasn't just going to be a sound. It was going to be a reckoning. The third dawn didn't break, it bruised. The sky was a mottled collection of heavy, swollen clouds that promised a burying snow, turning the light outside into a dull, flat violet. Marcus stood by the door, his hand hovering inches from the cold metal of the deadbolt. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night pacing the small perimeter of the cabin, the floorboards groaning under the weight of his anxiety. The pattern had been set, 1 on the first day, 2 on the second. The logic of it gnawed at him, a terrible arithmetic that suggested an escalation he wasn't prepared to handle. He waited for the sound. He expected the scratching to be louder today, a chorus of desperation. But when it came, it was terrifyingly quiet. It wasn't a scratch. It was a faint thud, like a soft weight collapsing against the wood. Then silence. Marcus didn't hesitate. He threw the bolt and wrenched the door open, the wind snatching it from his grip and slamming it against the interior wall. They were there. 3 of them. Finn and Rosie stood shivering in the snow, their bodies forming a protective semicircle around a small, motionless bundle on the doormat. It was the third puppy. She was tiny, half the size of the others, a runt with fur the color of wet ash. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow that her ribs barely moved. She wasn't shivering anymore. She had passed the point of cold where the body fights back. She was fading. Finn looked up at Marcus, letting out a sharp, demanding bark, then nudged the small, limp body with his nose. Do something. The paralysis that had held Marcus for 6 months, the fear of touching, of caring, of failing, shattered in an instant. It wasn't a conscious choice, it was a biological imperative. Okay, Marcus breathed, dropping to his knees. Okay. He scooped up the runt. She felt weightless, like a hollow bird, her body temperature terrifyingly low. Without thinking, he grabbed Finn by the scruff, then Rosie, pulling them across the threshold. Inside, he commanded. Everyone inside. Now. He kicked the door shut, sealing out the wind. For the first time in his exile, the sanctuary of his grief had been breached. The cabin was no longer a tomb for the living. It was an emergency room. Marcus moved with a speed he hadn't possessed since before the fire. He laid the runt on the rug near the wood stove, stripping off his flannel shirt to wrap around her. His mind, usually fogged by depression, snapped into a crystalline focus. Memories of his time in the Boy Scouts, followed by 2 years of pre-med before he discovered his love for wood, flooded back. Hypothermia. Glycemic crash. Warmth but not too fast. Sugar. Stay, he ordered the other 2, though he didn't need to. Finn and Rosie were glued to the spot, their eyes locked on their dying sister. Marcus rushed to the kitchen. He grabbed a syringe from his old woodworking epoxy kit, flushed it with water, and mixed a slurry of warm water and sugar in a mug. He grabbed a hot water bottle, filled it, and wrapped it in a towel. Back at the rug, he worked with surgical precision. He positioned the hot water bottle near the runt's core, not touching the skin, just radiating heat. He lifted her lip. Her gums were pale, almost white. Come on, little one, he whispered, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. You didn't walk through hell just to die on the finish line. He dribbled the sugar water onto her tongue, drop by drop, massaging her throat to trigger the swallow reflex. For a terrible minute, nothing happened. The liquid pooled at the corner of her mouth. Finn let out a low whine and crept forward, licking the runt's ear. Then a cough. A tiny hacking sputter. The runt swallowed. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that were a startling, cloudy blue, anxious and unfocused. She took another swallow, then a jagged breath that sounded like tearing paper. Marcus slumped back on his heels, exhaling a breath he didn't know he was holding. Good girl? He looked at the other 2. They were watching him with an intensity that unsettled him. They weren't just animals begging for food. They were a family unit assessing his competence. I need help, Marcus muttered. He stood up and grabbed the phone. Dr. Patricia Alvarez was the only vet who serviced the remote mountain districts, a woman with a spine of steel and a 4-wheel drive truck that could climb a vertical wall. She arrived 40 minutes later, stomping snow off her boots in Marcus's entryway, carrying a medical bag that looked like it had seen war. I didn't think you'd ever call me, Marcus, she said, her eyes scanning the room before landing on the pile of fur by the stove. And I certainly didn't think it would be for this. She went to work immediately. She listened to hearts, checked temperatures, and examined the raw wire marks on Finn and Rosie's necks. She gave the runt a shot of fluids and antibiotics, her movements efficient and practiced. Malnutrition across the board, Patricia said, her voice tight. Internal parasites. The big male has an infected laceration on his paw. The female has hip bruising. And the little one. She stroked the runt's head. Early stage pneumonia. If you hadn't brought her inside when you did, she would be dead right now. She sat back, peeling off her latex gloves. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the cabin's scent of pine and wood smoke. Marcus, she said, fixing him with a hard stare. These aren't strays. You know that, right? I know, Marcus said. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the sofa, watching the runt sleep. The wire marks. It's worse than that, Patricia said, gesturing to the dogs. Look at their teeth, their muscle structure. These are highline working shepherds. Expensive genetics. But they've been kept in filth. Their pads are burned from urine-soaked concrete. Someone is breeding them for profit and spending zero on care. She packed her bag with a sharp zip. They escape. Probably squeezed through a fence that wasn't fixed. And they walked miles in this weather. She looked at Marcus. They chose you. Dogs like this. They have instincts about people. They passed plenty of other cabins down the ridge. They stopped here. I'm not a dog owner, Patricia, Marcus said, the old panic rising in his chest. I can't keep them. I can't be responsible for. You already are, she cut him off. The shelters are full, Marcus. And if these are escaped property from an illegal mill, putting them in the system puts a target on them. The owner will come looking. If they're in a shelter, he can claim them with a fake bill of sale before we can build a case. She stood up and handed him a sheet of paper. Feeding schedule. Medication instructions. Keep them warm. I'll be back in 3 days to check the runt's lungs. She opened the door, letting a swirl of snow in. Give them names, Marcus. It helps the medicine work. When the door clicked shut, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with the soft breathing of 3 living things. Marcus looked at them. The big male, the one who had stood guard, was watching the door where the vet had left. Finn, Marcus said softly, was a good name. Strong. Reliable. The female, the one who had stepped in front of her brother yesterday, lifted her head. Rosie, he whispered, for the bloom of red on her healing neck, and for the hope that springs up in winter. And the runt. The tiny thing wrapped in his flannel shirt, barely larger than his boot. She let out a soft sigh in her sleep, a sound so fragile it made his chest ache. Wren, he said. A small bird that survives the harshest winters. Wren stirred, opening those cloudy blue eyes to look at him. For a second, the anxiety in her gaze vanished, replaced by a pure, heavy trust. She shifted, dragging her weak body inches across the rug until her head rested against Marcus's knee. Marcus froze. He felt the heat of her small body seeping into his jeans. He felt Finn lay his chin on his other foot. He felt Rosie lean against his side. He was surrounded, trapped by their need. For 6 months, Marcus had believed that his love was a dangerous thing, a fire that consumed everything it touched. But as he sat there on the floor, listening to the wind howl outside, he realized the crisis had done something he couldn't do for himself. It had forced him to open the door. He reached down, his hand trembling slightly, and rested it on Wren's back. He could feel her heart beating, fast, erratic, but there. I've got you, he whispered into the empty cabin. I've got you. But as the adrenaline faded and the reality of the situation settled in, Marcus looked at the wire marks on Finn's neck again. Patricia was right. These dogs were expensive inventory. They were property. And somewhere in the dark forest that surrounded his cabin, a man who viewed living things as commodities was counting his losses. Marcus looked at the window. The snow was falling harder now, erasing tracks, hiding secrets. But deep down, he knew the snow wouldn't stop what was coming. The puppies had found him, yes, but they had left a trail. And trails were meant to be followed. The first week wasn't measured in hours, but in heartbeats and warm milk. The cabin, once a mausoleum of silence and dust, had transformed into a nursery of chaotic life. Marcus didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, his internal clock rewired to the rhythms of 3 damaged creatures who needed him to survive. He moved through the days in a haze of exhaustion that was strangely clearer than the grief he had lived in for months. There was no time to stare at the wall and hate himself when Wren needed her sugar water every 3 hours, or when Rosie tried to chew the leg of the kitchen table, or when Finn needed his bandages changed. Marcus watched them with the same obsessive attention to detail he used to apply to his joinery. He began to see the architecture of their trauma, the way their personalities had formed around the cruelty they had escaped. Finn, the protector, never fully slept. Even when his eyes were closed, his ears swiveled like radar dishes. He always positioned himself between his sisters and the door, a silent sentinel who had learned too young that the world was a weapon. Rosie was the spark. As her strength returned, so did her reckless bravery. She was the first to explore the dark corners of the pantry, the first to bark at the wind howling in the chimney. She tested boundaries with a frantic energy, as if she needed to prove she was alive by breaking rules she didn't fully understand. And then there was Wren. The runt. The shadow. Wren didn't care about the door or the pantry. She only cared about Marcus. If he moved to the sink, she dragged her blanket to the sink. If he sat in the armchair, she sat on his foot. Her anxiety was a physical weight. If he left the room to use the bathroom, she would let out a high, keening wail that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in the wood, a sound of pure structural failure. It was this sound that drove Marcus to the corner of the room he had avoided for 6 months. The workshop corner. His tools lay there under a canvas drop cloth, looking like bodies in a morgue. He needed to build a proper sleeping enclosure. The cardboard boxes and towels weren't holding heat, and the draft from the floor was too dangerous for Wren's recovering lungs. Marcus stood before the canvas, his hand trembling as he reached out. He pulled the cloth back. The smell of linseed oil and steel hit him, visceral and sharp. He picked up a smoothing plane. The weight of it in his palm felt like shaking hands with a ghost. "Hey boss, check this out." Jamie's voice echoed in his mind, clear as a bell. Marcus closed his eyes. He could see him, Jamie, 19 years old, grinning through a mask of sawdust, holding up a dovetail joint he had finally perfected. "Fits like a glove. I told you I'd get it." The memory shifted, darkening. The smell of linseed oil twisted into the smell of melting plastic and scorching timber. The frantic phone calls. The red glow against the night sky. I wasn't there. I should have been there. Marcus's grip on the plane tightened until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't do this. He couldn't touch these tools. They belonged to a man who had failed. Then a soft whimper cut through the flashback. Marcus looked down. Wren was sitting at his feet, staring up at him with those cloudy, anxious blue eyes. She wasn't seeing his past. She was seeing her only source of warmth. She shivered just once. Marcus let out a ragged breath. He looked at the tool, then at the dog. "All right," he whispered. "For you." He began to work. It was slow at first, clumsy. But the muscle memory of 20 years didn't vanish easily. He found some scrap cedar in the woodpile, good for insulation, rot-resistant. He measured, marked, and cut. The sound of the saw biting into the wood was loud, shocking in the small space, but Finn didn't bark. He watched, fascinated, his head tilted. For 3 hours, Marcus wasn't a widower or a killer. He was a maker. He built a low-walled whelping box with raised floors to keep them off the cold draft, lined with the thickest foam he could scavenge from an old armchair. He sanded the edges until they were smooth as glass, terrified of a splinter hurting them. When he finished, he sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was a simple thing, crude compared to the high-end furniture he used to make, but it was the most important thing he had built in years. "Come here," he called softly. He lifted them in one by one. Rosie immediately began chewing the corner. Finn sniffed the perimeter, checking for structural integrity. Wren curled up in the exact center, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Marcus smiled, a foreign sensation that felt like cracking ice. He reached in to stroke Finn's neck, his fingers burying deep into the thick ruff of fur that was finally starting to clean up. His fingers brushed against something hard. It wasn't a mat. It felt metallic. Marcus frowned. He parted the fur, digging deeper near the skin behind the ear. There, clamped tight against the flesh, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a small, crude metal band. It looked like the crimps used on livestock fencing. Marcus leaned in, squinting in the dim light. There were characters stamped into the metal. BK 127. His stomach dropped. He checked Rosie. BK 128. Then Wren. BK 129. They weren't names. They were inventory numbers. The warmth of the moment evaporated. The box he had just built wasn't a bed. It was a hiding spot. These tags were industrial, permanent. They marked these living creatures as assets in a ledger. And assets were something people came looking for. Marcus sat back, the realization settling heavy in his gut. He had been pretending they were just lost souls who found each other. But BK 127 implied a BK 1 through BK 126. It implied a massive operation. It implied a man who didn't see puppies but profit margins. That night, the anxiety returned with a vengeance. Marcus tried to sleep in his own bed, leaving the puppies in their new cedar box by the stove. He tossed and turned, listening to the wind, his mind racing with images of cages and fire. Every time he drifted off, he saw Jamie's face, then the metal tags, the numbers glowing like brands. Around 3 a.m. he woke with a start, his heart hammering. The cabin was silent. Too silent. He sat up, panic gripping him. Had the fire gone out? Had Ren stopped breathing? He reached for the lamp, but stopped when he felt the weight. They were there. Finn was sprawled across Marcus's feet, a heavy, anchoring warmth. Rosie was curled in the crook of his knees. And Ren was pressed against his chest, her small head tucked under his chin, her heartbeat syncing with his. They had climbed out of the box he had built. They had dragged themselves across the cold floor in the dark. Not because they were cold, the box was warm. Not because they were hungry. Marcus lay back in the dark, tears he hadn't shed for 6 months pricking at his eyes. He had spent this whole week terrified that he would hurt them. He thought he was toxic, a man who brought death to everything he loved. He had tried to keep a distance to build them a box so they wouldn't have to rely on him too much. But as Ren let out a soft snore against his sternum, the truth hit him hard enough to bruise. They aren't afraid I'll hurt them, he realized, his hand coming up to cover Ren's small body. They're afraid I'll leave. They didn't see a failure. They didn't see a man who let a boy die. They just saw the one person who had opened the door when the rest of the world stayed shut. For the first time since the fire, Marcus didn't feel the crushing weight of guilt. He felt the terrifying, heavy, beautiful weight of being needed. He closed his eyes, his hand resting protectively over the inventory tag hidden in Ren's fur. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered into the dark. But as he drifted back to sleep, holding his stolen family close, Marcus didn't notice the flash of headlights cutting through the trees a mile down the mountain road. He didn't see the truck pausing at the turnoff to his trail, or the man inside checking a GPS tracker that was blinking a slow, steady rhythm. The puppies had found safety, yes. But they hadn't just brought their love to Marcus's door. They had brought a signal. And someone was finally picking it up. The decision to leave the cabin felt like a betrayal. Marcus stood by the cedar box, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of 3 small chests. They were finally sleeping, deep, healing sleep that twitched with dreams of chasing rabbits instead of running for their lives. But the metal tags clamped to their necks, cold and industrial, were a screaming alarm in the quiet room. BK 127. He had to know. He grabbed his heavy parka, pulled a wool cap low over his ears and checked his phone battery. 84%. Enough to document a crime scene. Enough to call for help if he died. The snow had stopped falling an hour ago, leaving the world suspended in a blinding, pristine white. But the fresh powder hadn't completely erased the past. Marcus moved away from the cabin, backtracking the path the puppies had taken 3 days ago. It wasn't hard to find. It was a trail of desperation. Here, a broken sapling where Finn must have dragged himself through the brush. There, a depression in a snowbank where they had huddled for warmth. And then the sights that made Marcus's stomach turn, bright, crystallized drops of red blood. He followed the breadcrumbs of pain for 2 miles, moving deeper into the dense timber of the San Juan National Forest than he had ventured in years. The terrain grew steeper, the pines thicker. This was ghost country, off the hiking trails, where the silence was usually absolute. But as he crested a ridge, the silence died. It was replaced by a smell first, acrid and stinging. Ammonia. Bleach. The unmistakable, stomach-churning stench of too many living things confined in too small a space. Marcus dropped to a crouch, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below him, nestled in a hidden valley that used to be a logging staging area, sat a structure that shouldn't have been there. It was a sprawling, ramshackle warehouse, the corrugated metal roof patched with tarps. High fences topped with razor wire cut a jagged line through the snow. He crept closer, moving tree to tree until he was close enough to hear the sound. It was a low, constant drone. Not machinery. Barking. Hundreds of voices, muffled by metal walls, crying out in a chaotic sympathy of misery. Marcus hid behind a massive spruce tree, his breath shallow. A heavy steel door on the side of the warehouse banged open. 2 men stepped out onto a loading dock, their breath pluming in the freezing air. One was young, nervous, holding a clipboard. The other was a nightmare carved from ice. He was a bear of a man, late 50s, wearing a shearling coat that looked expensive and out of place in the filth. A jagged scar ran from his jawline into the collar of his coat, pulling his mouth into a permanent, cruel sneer. This was Viktor Kozlov. Marcus didn't know the name yet, but he knew the type. He had seen men like this on the news, men who looked at the world and saw only things to be consumed. "You are telling me," Kozlov's voice carried across the clearing, heavy with an Eastern European accent and trembling with suppressed violence, "that 3 units just walked out?" through the fence. The wire was loose, Mr. Kozlov, the younger man stammered. The snow load, it pushed the fence down just enough. We fixed it, but the inventory is gone, Kozlov snarled. He stepped forward and shoved the younger man. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was dismissive, like kicking a piece of trash. The cream male, the alpha, and the runt. That litter was pre-sold. Do you know what the deposit was on that male? Marcus felt a cold sweat break out under his layers. The cream male. Finn. They can't have gone far, the young man pleaded. Not in this storm. They're probably dead and adrift somewhere. Kozlov lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating the hard planes of his face. Dogs like that don't die easy. They find heat. They find people. He turned, his eyes scanning the tree line. For a terrifying second, his gaze seemed to bore straight through the spruce tree where Marcus was hiding. Take the truck. Check the access roads. Check the cabins within a 5-mile radius. If you find them, bring them back. If anyone asks, they are lost family pets. If they resist, Kozlov flicked ash onto the snow. Remind them that theft of property is a felony. And I protect my property. Marcus's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped his phone. He managed to lift it, the camera lens peering through the pine needles. Click. A photo of the warehouse. Click. A zoom on the men. Click. The license plate of the black pickup truck parked near the dock. The shutter sound was silent, digital, but it felt deafening. Suddenly, a Doberman chain near the fence lunged, letting out a roar of a bark, staring directly at Marcus's position. Kozlov's head snapped toward the ridge. What is it? Marcus didn't wait. He pulled back, sliding on his stomach until he was over the crest, then scrambled to his feet. He ran. He didn't care about noise now, he cared about distance. He ran until his lungs burned, until the smell of ammonia was replaced by the clean scent of pine, until the only sound was the pounding of his own blood in his ears. He made it back to the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip, casting long bruised shadows across the snow. He burst through the door, locking it behind him, leaning his back against the wood, gasping for air. The scene inside was painfully peaceful. Wren lifted her head from the cedar box, letting out a soft, welcoming chirp. Finn thumped his tail. Marcus looked at them, his inventory. 3 units. He sank to the floor, pulling his phone out. The photos were clear. He had the proof. He could call Sarah Kim right now. He could send the pictures. The raid would happen tonight. Kozlov would be arrested. But then he looked at the wire mark on Finn's neck. If he called the authorities, the puppies became evidence. Exhibit A, B, and C. They would be seized, taken to a shelter, processed, and Kozlov had lawyers. Marcus knew how the system worked. Property disputes could tie animals up in litigation for months. They would be put in cages, cleaner cages maybe, but cages nonetheless. Separated. And if Kozlov had connections? If he produced papers claiming ownership before the state could prove abuse? Marcus looked at Wren. She had crawled out of the box and was limping toward him, her tail tucked but wagging. She needed medicine in 2 hours. She needed warmth. She needed him. I can't, Marcus whispered, the guilt tasting like ash. I can't give you back to the system. A sharp knock on the door made him jump so violently he dropped the phone. Finn let out a low, guttural growl, a sound Marcus hadn't heard before. The protector. Marcus scrambled up, shoving the phone into his pocket. He checked the peephole. It wasn't Kozlov's men. It was a green parka, a ranger hat. Sarah Kim. Marcus forced his breathing to slow. He opened the door. Sarah, he said, blocking the view of the interior with his body. 2 visits in 2 days. People will start to talk. Sarah didn't smile. She stood on the porch, snow dusting her shoulders, looking past him. She held a clipboard. I'm not here for social hour, Marcus, she said, her voice tight. We've been tracking strange purchase patterns at the feed store in town. Someone bought 500 pounds of low-grade kibble and 50 bales of straw. Cash. She looked him in the eye. That mill I told you about? We think it's close. Real close. Marcus felt the phone burning a hole in his pocket. Show her, his conscience screamed. Show her the pictures. And? Marcus asked, his voice steady. And? Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. The supply truck was seen turning up this access road. Your road, Marcus. She paused, sniffing the air. And I hear dogs. Inside the cabin, Rosie barked, a sharp, playful yip. Marcus didn't blink. I told you. I saw tracks. I put some food out. A couple of strays came by. I'm trying to gain their trust so I can bring them in. It was a half-truth, the most dangerous kind of lie. Sarah studied his face. She had known him since the investigation of the fire. She knew his grief. She knew he was a man who didn't lie. "Marcus," she said softly, "if you're harboring animals that are part of an investigation, you know that puts you in the middle of a federal case. You know I can't protect you if you withhold evidence." "I know the law, Sarah," Marcus said, his hand gripping the doorframe. "If I see anything suspicious, you'll be the first to call." She held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. Then she sighed, stepping back. "Okay. Stay safe, Marcus. These guys, they aren't woodworkers. They're monsters." She turned and walked back to her truck. Marcus watched her drive away, the taillights fading into the gloom. He closed the door and locked it, sliding the deadbolt home. He had just lied to the law. He had just protected a crime scene. He turned around. The 3 puppies were sitting in a row watching him. They didn't know about laws or evidence or property rights. They only knew that the man at the door hadn't let the cold in. Marcus sank down beside them, pulling Wren into his lap. He looked at the phone in his hand, then at the darkening window. He wasn't just a grieving hermit anymore. He was an accomplice. And he knew something Sarah didn't. Kozlov wasn't just looking for inventory. He was looking for the alpha. He was looking for Finn. Marcus reached over and rested his hand on Finn's neck, feeling the pulse beneath the fur. The cabin felt smaller tonight. The walls felt thinner. He had found the monster's lair, but in doing so, he had led the monster's gaze right back to his own front door. And as the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, Marcus realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be healing the puppies. It was going to be surviving what came next. Because Kozlov had said one thing that terrified Marcus more than the cages. They find heat. Outside, in the freshly fallen snow, Marcus's footprints led away from the mill. But footprints go both ways. And the snow was stopping. The trail was clear. The memory didn't come like a tide. It came like a guillotine. It started with a sound. In the cabin, Wren was pacing near the door, her separation anxiety spiking as Marcus moved to the kitchen to boil water. She let out a high, repetitive whine, a sound of escalating panic that drilled straight into Marcus's auditory nerve. The sound warped. The kitchen dissolved. The smell of pine and snow vanished, replaced by the acrid, metallic tang of ozone and scorched varnish. Marcus wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was back in the truck, his hand resting on the gearshift of his old Ford, the Colorado sun blinding him through the windshield. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that feels so aggressively ordinary that you never suspect it's the last day of your life as you know it. "I'm heading to the lumber yard in Montrose," Marcus had said, tossing his keys in the air. "Don't wait up if I grab lunch." Jamie Rodriguez looked up from the workbench, his safety goggles perched on his forehead, pushing back a mop of curly dark hair. He was 19, clumsy with his feet but a prodigy with his hands. "Hey boss, that belt sander is sparking again. The chaotic one. Should I wait for you to swap the cord?" Marcus had paused, his hand on the doorframe. He knew that sander. The wiring was frayed near the housing. He had meant to fix it a week ago. Then 3 days ago. Then yesterday. "Just keep it on low speed," Marcus had said. The words that would haunt him for eternity. "I'll fix it when I get back. Finish the table, Jamie. Client needs it Friday." "You got it, boss." Jamie smiled, a wide, trusting grin that didn't know it was expiring. The drive was long. The radio was loud. Marcus was singing along to some classic rock station, drumming on the steering wheel. He felt good. Business was booming. Elena had been gone 4 years, and the sharp edge of grief was finally dulling into a manageable ache. Then the vibration. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced over. Jamie. Marcus ignored it. He was navigating a tricky merge on the highway. "I'll call him back in 10 minutes. 5 minutes later. Bus. Jamie. Kid probably can't find the stain, Marcus thought, annoyed. Figure it out, Jamie. 10 minutes later. Bus. When Marcus finally pulled into the lumberyard parking lot and picked up the phone, there were 7 missed calls. No voicemails. Just a frantic digital record of panic. He called back. It went straight to voicemail. And then he saw the smoke. It wasn't a wisp. It was a black oily column rising miles away, staining the perfect blue sky. It rose from the direction of the workshop. The drive back was a blur of illegal speeds and screaming prayers. Please let it be the brush. Please let it be the trash bin. It wasn't. By the time he skidded into the gravel lot, the workshop was a roaring mouth of fire. The heat was physical, a wall that punched the air from his lungs. The roof had already collapsed. The fire department was there, spraying useless arcs of water into the inferno. Marcus had tried to run in. It took 3 firemen to hold him back. He screamed Jamie's name until his vocal cords tore, fighting against the arms that restrained him, watching the windows blow out, watching his life's work and his surrogate son turn into carbon. They found Jamie near the back door. It had been blocked by a stack of lumber Marcus had forgotten to move. He hadn't burned. The autopsy said smoke inhalation. He had fallen asleep in the dark, waiting for the boss who never answered the phone. The whining in the cabin hit a fever pitch. Marcus snapped back to the present, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The guilt was so fresh, so visceral, he could taste the smoke in his mouth. He spun around, his eyes wild. Ren was at his feet, pawing at his leg, desperate for comfort. "Stop it!" Marcus roared, the sound tearing out of his throat before he could stop it. He kicked out, not connecting but a violent spasm of rejection. "Get away. Leave me alone." The silence that followed was absolute. Ren scrambled back, her claws clicking on the wood, crashing into the leg of the sofa. She let out a terrified yelp and flattened herself against the floor, shaking. Finn and Rosie, who had been sleeping, bolted upright, ears pinned back. Marcus stood in the center of the kitchen, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Ren, cowering, terrified of him. "I did it again," the voice in his head whispered. "I am destruction. I am fire." His legs gave out. Marcus sank to the floor, his back sliding down the cabinet doors until he hit the linoleum. He buried his face in his hands, pulling his knees to his chest, curling into a ball of shame. The sob that ripped through him was ugly and jagged. "I can't," he choked out. "I can't do this." He waited for them to run. He expected them to retreat to the cedar box, to realize that the man who fed them was unstable, dangerous. But they didn't run. A moment passed. Then he felt a weight on his knee. Marcus lowered his hands slowly. Finn was standing there. The large male didn't look frightened. He looked solemn. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, massive paw directly on Marcus's shaking hand. He didn't pull away. He just held it there, a silent, grounding pressure. Then Rosie moved in, nuzzling her wet nose into Marcus's neck, licking the salt from his skin. And Ren, the one he had shouted at, the one he had terrified, crawled forward on her belly. She didn't cower. She wedged herself into the space between Marcus's chest and his knees, burying her face in his shirt, seeking the very source of her fear for comfort. "I failed him," Marcus whispered to the dogs, the confession finally leaving his lips. "He called me and I didn't answer. I killed him. And if I keep you, I'll get you killed too." Finn leaned his weight against Marcus, letting out a long exhale as if to say, "We are here now." A knock at the door made them all freeze. But this wasn't the secret knock of a puppy, nor the aggressive pounding of an enemy. It was authoritative but polite. Marcus wiped his face with his sleeve, struggling to compose himself. He couldn't stand up. The door opened. It was Dr. Patricia Alvarez. She had let herself in, likely hearing the distress, or simply because in the mountains, an unlocked door is an invitation to check on your neighbor. She stopped in the entryway, snow melting on her shoulders. She took in the scene instantly, the overturned chair, the cowering man on the floor, the 3 dogs forming a protective shield around him. She didn't ask what happened. She set her bag down and walked over, sitting on the floor across from him, ignoring the dust. "Check-up time," she said softly, but she wasn't looking at the dogs. She was looking at Marcus. "I yelled at her," Marcus whispered, his voice hollow. "Ren. She was just whining and I flashed back. To the fire." He looked at Patricia, his eyes red-rimmed. "You have to take them. Take them to the shelter." I'm not right. "I'm poison, Patricia." Patricia reached out and checked Ren's gums, her touch automatic, but her focus remained on Marcus. "You think you're protecting them by sending them away," she said. "I killed my apprentice," Marcus said. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "I left a faulty sander plugged in. I ignored his calls. He died because of me. I don't get to have this. I don't get to save things." Patricia stopped moving. She sat perfectly still for a moment, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the cracks underneath. "My son's name was David," she said. Her voice was steady, but it lacked its usual command. "He was 7. Leukemia. Acute myeloid." Marcus looked up, startled. "I was the chief resident at Denver General at the time," Patricia continued, staring at a knot in the floorboards. "I had access to the best specialists in the country. I knew every trial, every drug, every protocol. I spent 18 months fighting it with every ounce of medical knowledge I had." She looked at Marcus. He died in my arms on a Tuesday morning. I'm a doctor, Marcus. My entire purpose is to save lives. And I couldn't save the only one that mattered. She reached out and scratched Finn behind the ears. For 2 years I didn't practice. I thought the same thing you're thinking. That I was a fraud. That I was death. How did you stop? Marcus asked. I didn't, she said. I just realized something. Guilt is a greedy thing, Marcus. It wants to take everything. It took my son and then it tried to take my calling. But then a horse came in with a colic and I fixed it. And then a cat with a broken leg. And now, 3 shepherd puppies. She leaned forward, her dark eyes fierce. We don't honor the dead by refusing to love the living, Marcus. We dishonor them. We dishonor Jamie by letting his memory turn you into a ghost. He didn't die so you could stop living. Marcus looked down at Wren. She had fallen asleep against his chest, forgiving him completely for the shout, trusting him simply because he was there. I'm scared, Marcus admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Good, Patricia said, standing up and brushing off her knees. Fear means you have something to lose. And right now these 3 have a lot to lose. She walked to the window, her tone shifting back to business. Wren's lungs sound clear. Finn's infection is healing. But Marcus... She paused, looking out at the tree line where the shadows were lengthening into evening. When I drove up, she said slowly, I saw fresh tire tracks near the bottom of your driveway. Someone turned around there. Recently. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The moment of emotional catharsis shattered, replaced by the cold reality of the present. What kind of truck? He asked. Black, Patricia said. Big. Maybe a heavy-duty pickup. Marcus pulled Wren tighter against his chest. The internal ghosts had been quieted, but the external monsters were closing in. He looked at Finn, whose ears were pricked forward, listening to something human ears couldn't catch. They're scouting, Marcus said. Then you need to be ready, Patricia said, turning back to him. Because whatever ghosts you're fighting in here, they can't help you with what's out there. She left him then, the click of the door echoing like a gunshot. Marcus sat on the floor, surrounded by his stolen family. He had faced his past, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the cabin into darkness, he realized the past was the least of his problems. The past was dead. The man in the black truck was very, very alive. And he was coming back. The wilderness, which had once been Marcus's shield, was turning against him. It started with subtle shifts in the landscape, a broken branch at eye level where no deer would graze, a boot print with a heavy tread pattern preserved in the shade of a spruce tree, just 50 yards from the porch. The woods were no longer empty. They were watching. Marcus responded with the only language he had left, construction. He spent 2 days turning the cabin into a fortress. He installed motion-activated floodlights on the eaves, wiring them with the precision he used to apply to circuitry in high-end cabinetry. He mounted game cameras along the driveway and the ridge line, their lenses hidden behind bark and moss. Inside, the routine shifted from healing to preparation. Finn, stay, Marcus commanded, holding his hand up, palm out. In the center of the living room, Finn sat like a statue, his amber eyes locked on Marcus. The dog understood the gravity of the tone. He was growing stronger every day, the malnutrition fading to reveal a powerful, intelligent frame. Rosie, stay, Marcus repeated, turning to the female. Rosie huffed, shifting her weight. She sat, but her tail gave a defiant thump against the floor, and she let out a low grumble of protest. She was the rebel, the one who would challenge a bear if it looked at her wrong. Wren, Marcus softened his voice. The runt was trembling under the kitchen table. The command training terrified her. She interpreted the stillness as a prelude to punishment. She crawled out slowly, belly low to the ground, and pressed her head against Marcus's boot. It's okay, he whispered, scratching her ears. We have to be quiet. Quiet is how we live. He taught them the command silent. It was the hardest lesson. When he put a finger to his lips, they had to stop whining, stop pacing, stop breathing if possible. Finn picked it up instantly, freezing like a pointer. Rosie struggled to contain her energy. Wren just tried to disappear. Marcus knew he was training them for a war he hoped wouldn't come. But hope, he was learning, was a poor strategy. On Thursday, the illusion of safety cracked further. Sarah Kim's Ranger truck crunched up the driveway, but this time she didn't get out. She rolled down the window as Marcus walked out to meet her, blocking the view of the porch where the puppies were hidden behind the woodpile. Dead end, Sarah said, her frustration evident in the tight line of her jaw. We raided the warehouse location you hinted at. The old logging site. Marcus's heart stopped. And? Empty, she spat. Cleared out. They must have moved operations 2 nights ago. Just some empty cages and a lot of bleach. Without animals, without a perpetrator, I have nothing, Marcus. Unless someone comes forward with something concrete. She looked at him, searching his face. If you know anything else. I don't, Marcus lied, the words tasting like copper. He couldn't tell her yet. If the mill was gone, Kozlov was mobile. If Marcus handed the puppies over now, they'd be evidence in a cold case, trapped in administrative limbo while Kozlov vanished. Be careful, Sarah warned, shifting gears. Locals are saying there's a black truck patrolling the back roads, asking questions about lost property. Marcus watched her leave, the dread settling in his gut like wet cement. They moved. That meant Kozlov wasn't just cutting losses, he was consolidating. And he was still looking for the ones that got away. The next day Marcus ran out of dog food. He had no choice but to go into town. He left the puppies in the cabin, locking the door and double-checking the window latches. Silent, he ordered. Finn sat by the door, Rosie by the window, Wren in the cedar box. The drive to town was tense. Every passing vehicle looked suspicious. At the feed store, Marcus loaded 2 50-pound bags of high-protein kibble onto a cart, keeping his head down. Building up an appetite? The voice came from behind him, smooth, heavy, and mocking. Marcus turned. Standing in the aisle, blocking the exit, was a man Marcus hadn't seen at the mill, but he recognized the type. Thick neck, shaved head, wearing a leather jacket that creaked as he moved. He was holding a bag of rawhide chews, tossing it lightly from hand to hand. Just hungry, Marcus said, gripping the handle of his cart. That's a lot of chow for one man, the stranger smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. They were dead, shark-like eyes. My boss, he lost some dogs recently. Shepherds. Beautiful animals. Very expensive. Shame, Marcus said, trying to step around him. The man sidestepped, blocking the path. He leaned in, smelling of stale tobacco and aggression. It is a shame. He's very sentimental about his property. He'd pay a reward. Or he'd be very unhappy if he found out someone was keeping them. Marcus met the man's gaze. I'm a woodworker. I don't know anything about dogs. The man looked at Marcus's hands, calloused, scarred. Then he looked at the kibble. Right. A woodworker. Well, if you see them, tell them Daddy is coming home. The man patted Marcus on the shoulder, a heavy, possessive tap, and walked away. Marcus abandoned the cart. He abandoned the supplies. He ran to his truck, his hands shaking so hard he could barely turn the key. He knows. The drive back was a blur of terror. He pushed the old Ford to 80 on the winding mountain roads, drifting around corners, praying he wasn't too late. Sentimental value. It was code. It meant Kozlov wasn't going to stop until he had recovered his investment or destroyed the thief. When Marcus skidded into his driveway, the silence of the cabin screamed at him. The front door was standing wide open. No, Marcus choked out. He threw the truck into park and sprinted across the snow, slipping, scrambling, bursting through the doorway. The interior was a wreck. The kitchen table was overturned. The sofa was slashed, stuffing exploding like snow across the room. His tool chest, the sacred space he had just reclaimed, was dumped out, chisels and saws scattered across the floor. Finn. Rosie. Marcus screamed, checking the cedar box. Empty. He checked the bedroom. The mattress was flipped. Wren. Panic, cold and black, swallowed him. He spun in the center of the destroyed room, his breath coming in jagged gasps. I failed them. I left them and he took them. Then a sound. A faint, rhythmic scratching. Not at the door. From the floor. Marcus dropped to his knees near the pantry. He threw aside the scattered cans and ripped up the rug he had nailed down 3 days ago. Beneath it was the trapdoor to the root cellar, a cold storage space he used for potatoes and preserves. He yanked the handle. The door groaned open. Looking up from the darkness were 3 pairs of eyes. Finn was at the bottom of the ladder, teeth bared, standing over his sisters. He hadn't barked. He hadn't whined. He had heard the intruder, herded his family into the hole, and kept them silent. Marcus collapsed, reaching down to pull them up one by one. He buried his face in Finn's fur, sobbing dry, hard tears. They were safe. But as he held them, looking around the wreckage of his home, he saw it. On the far wall, carved deep into the beautiful hand-finished walnut paneling Marcus had installed himself, was a message. The intruder hadn't used spray paint. He had used one of Marcus's own gouges, gouging the letters into the wood with brutal force. What's mine stays mine. Marcus stared at the jagged letters. This wasn't a theft. It was an invasion. It was a promise that walls and locks didn't matter. He stood up, his face hardening into something unrecognizable. He pulled his phone out. "Sarah?" he said the moment she answered. "Marcus." "I have them," he said, his voice flat, devoid of fear, replaced by a cold fury. "I have the 3 shepherds Kozlov is looking for. And I have photos of his operation before he moved it. I have the license plates of his trucks." The line went silent. "Marcus, you need to bring them in. Now." "I'm not bringing them to a cage," Marcus said. "I'm bringing them to a witness stand. But you need to tell me something first. If I give you everything, the photos, the dogs, my testimony, can you bury him? Can you put him away where he can never touch them again? With your testimony placing him at the scene? With the dogs as living proof of the abuse?" Sarah paused. "Yes, we can get a warrant. But Marcus, once you go on record, Kozlov will know it was you. You become the primary witness." "He already knows," Marcus said, looking at the carving on his wall. "He was in my house." "Get out of there," Sarah commanded, her voice rising. "I'm sending a unit. Do not stay in that cabin." Marcus hung up. He looked at the puppies. Wren was shivering again, traumatized by the violence of the invasion. Rosie was pacing, sniffing the scent of the stranger. Finn was watching the open door, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Marcus walked to his workbench. He picked up a heavy framing hammer, weighing it in his hand. Then he picked up a pry bar. He wasn't going to run. Sarah's unit was 40 minutes away. Kozlov's men were likely watching from the ridge, waiting to see if the message had been received. "We're not hiding in the cellar anymore," Marcus told the dogs. He began to board up the windows, driving nails with deafening cracks. The safety of isolation was gone. The myth that he could hide from the world was shattered. He had tried to be a ghost, but ghosts couldn't protect anything. As he hammered the last board over the kitchen window, cutting off the view of the darkening forest, the motion sensor light on the back porch flickered on. Marcus froze. Finn's ears snapped forward. He didn't growl. He looked at Marcus and then he looked at the back door. The handle slowly, silently began to turn. Kozlov hadn't just sent a message. He had come to collect. Sarah had promised Dawn. The warrant was signed, the tactical team was briefed, and the raid was scheduled for 6 o'clock hours. But as Marcus sat in the dark living room, gripping the handle of a heavy hickory mallet, he knew that evil didn't work on a government schedule. The cabin was a tomb of anticipation. He had boarded the windows, turning his sanctuary into a bunker. The puppies were corralled in the corner behind the overturned sofa. Finn was pacing, a low rumble vibrating in his chest that Marcus could feel through the floorboards. Rosie was stiff, hackles raised. Even Wren, usually paralyzed by fear, was standing, her small nose twitching as she scented the air seeping under the door. Midnight came and went. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then the motion sensor on the back porch flooded the snow with blinding white light. There was no stealth this time. No scratching. The back door exploded inward with a deafening crash of splintering wood and twisted metal. Marcus didn't wait. He didn't ask who was there. He launched himself from the shadows, swinging the mallet with the force of a man defending his soul. 2 shapes surged through the broken door frame, men in dark coats, faceless in the gloom. The first one raised a crowbar, but Marcus was faster. The mallet connected with the man's shoulder, a sickening crack that sent the intruder spinning into the wall. "Get them," a voice roared from outside. "Kozlov." The second man tackled Marcus, driving him into the kitchen island. The mallet clattered across the floor. Marcus grappled with the intruder, feeling leather gloves clawing at his throat, smelling stale tobacco and sweat. He was a craftsman, not a fighter, but desperation gave him a savage strength. He reached blindly, his hand closing around a chisel on the counter. He drove it downward, not into flesh but into the man's thick coat, pinning him momentarily to the wood. Then the shadows came alive. The puppies didn't run. They didn't hide. They attacked. Finn launched himself like a missile, his jaws locking onto the intruder's ankle. The man screamed, his grip on Marcus loosening as 80 pounds of fury anchored him to the floor. Rosie was a blur of motion, darting between legs, snapping and tripping the first man who was trying to get back up. And Wren, the runt, the shadow, stood atop the overturned sofa and unleashed a barking barrage so high and piercing it sounded like an air raid siren, a beacon screaming into the night. Marcus shoved the man off, scrambling to his feet. "Finn, release." "Back." But before he could regroup, a heavy boot stepped through the shattered doorway. Viktor Kozlov stood framed by the security light, a silhouette of bulk and malice. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a red jerrycan. "You are a difficult man, Mr. Chin," Kozlov said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "And my property is defective." He didn't aim for Marcus. He unscrewed the cap and swung the can in a wide arc. Gasoline splashed across the floorboards, soaking the rug, the walls, the cedar box Marcus had built with such care. The smell was instant and overpowering, the perfume of destruction. "If I cannot sell them," Kozlov said, pulling a silver lighter from his pocket, "then I write them off." "No!" Marcus screamed, lunging forward. Kozlov flicked the lighter and dropped it. The world dissolved into orange and roar. The fumes ignited with a whump that knocked the wind out of the room. A wall of fire shot up between Marcus and the door, separating him from the exit, separating him from the intruder. Kozlov stepped back into the night, laughing. Let it burn. The heat was instantaneous. The dry timber of the cabin, seasoned by years of high-altitude sun, drank the fire greedily. And in that moment Marcus Chin died. He wasn't in the cabin anymore. The roar of the flames became the roar of the workshop. The smell of gasoline became the smell of varnish. He saw the table leg Jamie had been sanding. He heard the phone ringing in the empty void. "I'm not here. I'm not here." The PTSD slammed into him like a physical blow. His muscles locked. His vision tunneled. He stood frozen in the center of the inferno, watching the flames lick the ceiling beams, waiting for the roof to collapse, waiting to die as he should have died 6 months ago. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was a statue of guilt, accepting his punishment. "Marcus." A voice screamed in his head. Jamie's voice. But it wasn't a voice. It was a bark. Guttural. Demanding. Something slammed into his leg. Art. Marcus blinked, the vision of the workshop fracturing. He looked down. Finn was there. The dog had ignored the fire, ignored the open window where he could have escaped. He was body-checking Marcus, biting at his jeans, pulling him. His amber eyes were wide, reflecting the flames, but they weren't filled with fear. They were filled with command. The paralysis shattered. Marcus gasped, sucking in hot, smoky air. He looked around. Rosie was cowering under the table. Ren was circling in tight, panicked loops near the sofa. "Not this time," Marcus roared over the sound of the fire. "Not this time." He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the floor. He scooped Ren up with one arm, shoving her under his jacket. He grabbed Rosie by the scruff, pulling her close. "Finn, with me." The front door was a wall of fire. The back door was blocked by debris. The window. The boarded-up kitchen window. Marcus grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. He didn't feel the heat of the handle. He swung it with everything he had at the boards he had nailed up hours ago. Crack. The wood splintered. Smash. The glass shattered. Fresh, freezing air rushed in, feeding the fire, but offering a way out. "Go!" Marcus yelled, lifting Rosie and shoving her through the jagged opening into the snow. "Finn, go!" Finn hesitated, looking back at Marcus. "I'm right behind you," Marcus screamed. "Go!" Finn leaped, clearing the sill. Marcus climbed onto the counter. The heat was searing the hair on his arms. The smoke was blinding. He clutched Ren to his chest and dived through the window, tumbling out onto the snowbank. He landed hard, rolling to extinguish the sparks on his clothes. He scrambled up, dragging himself away from the structure. Finn. Rosie. They were there, circling him, barking. Marcus turned back. The cabin was fully engulfed now, a torch against the night sky. The roof groaned and collapsed inward with a shower of sparks, crushing the life he had built, crushing the ghosts he had lived with. He stood in the snow watching it burn. But he wasn't screaming. He wasn't crying. He was holding Ren. And she was alive. Suddenly the night was ripped apart by blue and red lights. Sirens wailed, cutting through the crackle of the fire. Sarah Kim's truck skidded into the driveway, followed by 2 state police cruisers. Officers poured out, guns drawn. Near the tree line, a truck engine roared to life. Kozlov was trying to run. "Block the road." Sarah screamed into her radio. One of the cruisers swerved, blocking the exit. The black truck fishtailed, slamming into a snowbank. Doors opened. Men were dragged out onto the ice, shouting, handcuffed. Marcus didn't watch the arrest. He sank to his knees in the snow, the adrenaline crashing out of his system. He checked Ren. She was shaking but unharmed. Rosie was licking a scratch on her leg. Finn was sitting tall, watching the police, his chest heaving. Sarah ran over, her face pale in the strobe of the emergency lights. "Marcus, my God, are you hurt?" Marcus looked up at her. His face was blackened with soot. His eyebrows were singed. His hands were bleeding. But his eyes were clear. The haunted, hollow look that had defined him for 6 months was gone. "I got them out," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel. "I got them all out." Finn stepped forward and licked the soot from Marcus's cheek. Then Rosie joined in. Then Wren crawled out of his jacket and curled into his lap. They swarmed him, a pile of wet fur and unconditional love, burying him in warmth. Marcus buried his face in Finn's neck and wept. Not tears of grief. Tears of release. The fire had taken his past. It had taken his workshop. It had taken his home. But it hadn't taken his family. "I didn't fail," he whispered into the cold night air, holding them tight. "We saved each other." Sarah stood over them, putting a hand on his shoulder, but she didn't speak. She just let him breathe. But as the adrenaline faded and the cold set in, Marcus looked at the smoking ruin of his cabin. He had won the war, but he had lost the shelter. Kozlov was in cuffs, but the network was deep and the legal battle was just beginning. And in the pocket of his scorched jacket, his phone buzzed. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the police. It was a text message from an unknown number. Marcus pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen glowed bright in the darkness. "You think the fire ends this? You just burned down the only thing standing between you and the truth about where those dogs really came from." Marcus looked up at the moonlit trees. The arrest was too easy. Kozlov had smiled when he lit the fire. What? The snow didn't just melt that year. It felt like it was chased away by a sun that had finally remembered how to be warm. The San Juan Mountains, so recently a landscape of gray ice and black smoke, had exploded into a riot of green. Aspen leaves shimmied in the breeze, and the air smelled of wildflowers and fresh-cut cedar, the scent of life, not loss. Marcus Chin stood on the porch of the new cabin. It was different from the old one. The old cabin had been a fortress built to keep the world out. This one, raised over the scorch marks of the foundation by 50 pairs of hands from the town of Ouray, felt like a bridge. The community he had shunned had shown up with hammers, casseroles, and lumber the morning after the fire, refusing to let him rebuild alone. He took a sip of coffee, watching the yard. Finn was patrolling the perimeter, his gait powerful and assured, no longer the limping creature who had collapsed on the mat. Rosie was wrestling with a thick knot of rope in the grass, growling playfully. And Wren, the runt who used to shake at the sound of a falling leaf, was sunbathing on the top step, her belly exposed to the sky, a portrait of absolute safety. They were his. Legally, officially, and permanently. The judge had raised an eyebrow when Marcus insisted on adopting all three, suggesting that separating littermates might be easier. Marcus had simply signed the papers and said, "We don't break up families." A buzz of a saw cut through the morning air, drawing Marcus back to the present. He walked over to the new structure that stood where the garage used to be. It was larger, brighter, with wide windows that let the light flood in. Above the double doors hung a sign, carved from a slab of reclaimed cherry wood. The letters were deep, filled with gold leaf that caught the sun. Jamie's workshop, fine furniture, and free apprenticeships. Marcus stepped inside. The smell of sawdust hit him, triggering a ghost of a memory, but the panic didn't come. Instead, he felt a steady, quiet purpose. At the main workbench stood Maria. She was 18, with hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that held a shadow of things she was trying to forget. She was the daughter of one of the workers Kozlov had exploited at the mill, a man now testifying against his former boss. Maria had come to Marcus asking for a job, expecting rejection. She got an apron instead. "Watch your hand placement," Marcus said gently, stepping up beside her. Maria froze, the sander hovering over the oak table leg. "Is it wrong?" "No," Marcus corrected, his voice calm. "It's good. But check the cord. Make sure it's not looped around your ankle. Safety first. Always safety first." He watched her check the line, adjust her stance, and resume sanding. A year ago, that moment would have broken him. Today it healed him. Every safety lesson he taught Maria was a conversation with Jamie, a promise that his death wouldn't be in vain. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and walked out to see the Green Ranger truck pulling in. Sarah Kim stepped out, looking lighter than she had in months. She wasn't wearing her tactical vest, just her uniform and a genuine smile. "Coffee's fresh," Marcus called out. "I'll take a cup," Sarah said, leaning against the porch railing as Finn trotted over to lean against her leg. She scratched him behind the ears. "Just came from the courthouse." Marcus tensed slightly. "And?" "Kozlov got 20 years, she said. "Federal trafficking charges, animal cruelty, arson. He's done, Marcus. And because of the records you pulled from that warehouse before it was cleared, we tracked down the distribution network. 3 other mills in the state were raided yesterday. She looked out at the dogs. 47 dogs, Marcus. 47 German shepherds are sleeping in clean beds tonight because you didn't close the door. Marcus looked at the trio. Finn, Rosie, Wren. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the catalyst that had burned down a network of cruelty. It wasn't me, Marcus said softly. I just followed the lead. Well, Sarah pushed off the railing. However it happened, it's over. You can breathe now. She drank her coffee, chatted about the weather, and drove off. But as the dust settled, Marcus knew it wasn't just over. It was beginning. He spent the afternoon working on a personal project. He set up a station outside under the shade of the pines. He wasn't building a table or a chair for a client. He was carving a bench. It was a simple design, sturdy and welcoming, meant to sit on the porch right where the first knock had come. He picked up his gouge, the tool feeling like an extension of his hand. He began to carve the backrest. He didn't need a stencil. The shapes were burned into his memory. First, the silhouette of a protector, ears pricked forward, Finn. Next, a playful figure, tail high, Rosie. And finally, a small, crouching form looking up with hope, Wren. He worked for hours, the rhythm of the mallet and chisel a meditation. The sun dipped low, turning the sky to gold and violet. The dogs gathered around him as they always did, sensing the shift in the day. Wren hopped up onto the unfinished bench, curling up right over her carved likeness. Marcus paused, brushing the wood chips from her fur. He looked at the inscription he had just finished cutting into the base of the bench. They knocked 3 times. I finally answered. And learned that grace doesn't arrive once. It keeps knocking until we're brave enough to open the door. He ran his thumb over the letters. He had spent so long believing he was being punished, that the isolation was his sentence. He realized now that the silence of the cabin hadn't been a prison. It had been a waiting room. You knew, didn't you? He whispered to Finn, who was resting his head on Marcus's knee. You knew I needed you more than you needed me. Finn let out a long, contented sigh, his eyes closing. Marcus sat back, watching the sun disappear behind the peaks. The guilt over Jamie was still there, a quiet scar that would never fully fade. But it no longer burned. It had been transformed into the sawdust on Maria's apron, into the safety protocols on the wall, into the bench that invited others to sit and rest. He wasn't a man who had moved on. He was a man who had moved forward. As the first stars began to prick the twilight sky, Marcus stood up. Come on, he said, his voice strong and clear. Time for dinner. The 3 dogs scrambled up, tails wagging, and followed him inside. The door didn't slam shut this time. Marcus left it open for a moment, letting the cool spring air fill the house, knowing that whatever came next, joy, sorrow, or another desperate knock in the night, he was ready to answer it. Marcus thought the 3 knocks were the puppies asking for help. But God was knocking on Marcus's heart, asking him to live again. Sometimes miracles don't rescue us from our pain. They knock 3 times and teach us we're stronger than we knew. Marcus almost let them freeze because he was afraid to open his heart. Don't make the same mistake. If you scroll past this video without hitting subscribe, you're letting this story die in the cold, dark forest of the algorithm. These puppies survived because one man finally stopped ignoring the knock. Now it's your turn. Hit the like button to show you wouldn't leave them out in the snow, and comment, I answered, to prove that compassion still exists in this world.